Recently, a company called Vendasta in Saskatoon laid off around 20 employees and replaced parts of their work with AI. And situations like this are becoming more common as AI continues to change how businesses operate. Now imagine this: spending 4 years working toward a degree, investing your time and your money, only to graduate into a job market where parts of that role are already being automated. So it raises a bigger question. Do universities have a moral obligation to adapt their programs in response to AI-driven changes in the job market?
I don't think universities have a moral obligation to change their programs because of AI. At their core, universities provide education, not guaranteed career outcomes. AI is still evolving, and its long-term impact isn't fully clear. If universities constantly redesign programs based on uncertain trends, they risk reacting too quickly and undermining the stability and purpose of education. So rather than a moral obligation, this seems more like a market issue, where universities adapt if needed, but not because they're ethically required to.
I think universities do have a moral obligation to respond to changes like AI. They're not just providing degrees. They're preparing students for the future. If universities are aware that certain industries are being disrupted, not adapting could leave students unprepared. From that perspective, there's a responsibility to recognize these changes and adjust in ways that help students succeed long-term. So it's not just about education, it's about whether universities are responsibly preparing students for the world they're entering.
So if we look at this from a duty perspective, do universities actually owe students something more than just delivering education?
I think the duty universities have is primarily to provide a quality education, not to guarantee future outcomes. They can't fully control how industries evolve, or what jobs will exist in the future. So expecting them to constantly adjust programs based on uncertain changes like AI may go beyond their actual responsibility. Their duty is to educate, not to predict, or manage the job market for students.
I agree that universities can't predict the future perfectly, but I think their duty goes beyond just delivering content. If they're aware that certain industries are being disrupted, there's a responsibility to prepare students for that reality, not continue as if nothing is changing. Otherwise, students may be guided toward paths that won't exist in the same way by the time they graduate. So the duty isn't to guarantee outcomes, but to ensure students are realistically and responsibly prepared for the world they're entering.
Okay, so if we think about this in terms of outcomes, which approach actually creates better overall results? Adapting programs to respond to AI, or maintaining stability in how universities operate?
I think there's a risk that trying to adapt too quickly could actually create worse outcomes overall. If universities constantly redesign programs around trends like AI, they could end up weakening the depth and quality of education. There's also the risk of instability for students, for faculty, and for the institution if everything is always shifting. So from that perspective, maintaining some level of stability may lead to better long-term outcomes than reacting too quickly to uncertain changes.
I see that risk, but I think not adapting could create more harm overall. If universities continue operating the same way, while industries change, students could graduate with less relevant skills, increasing the risk of unemployment or underemployment. That doesn't just affect individuals. It impacts society more broadly. So even if adapting isn't perfect, it may still lead to better overall outcomes by helping students stay aligned with a changing job market.
So if we step back and look at the bigger picture, who is actually affected by this decision? And whose interests matter most?
I think the main groups affected are students, universities, faculty, and employers. Students are probably the most directly impacted, since their education and future careers are on the line. At the same time, universities and faculty have a lot of influence, but also constraints. They design programs, but are limited by resources, by structure, and by how quickly they can realistically change. So while students have a high level of interest, universities still hold most of the decision-making power in how, or if, things adapt.
I'd agree. Students, universities, faculty, and employers are all affected. But the key difference is how we interpret that impact. Students have the most at stake. They're investing their future, but have little control over how programs are designed. Universities, on the other hand, have much more power in shaping what's taught and how students are prepared. So when one group has the most at stake and the least power, and the other has the most power, it creates a stronger argument that universities carry more responsibility in how they respond.
But even beyond responsibility, what outside pressures are actually influencing what universities can or can't do here?
I think one of the biggest factors here is economic. Universities operate within budgets, staffing limits, and long-term structures. They can't just redesign programs overnight without significant cost and disruption. Changing curriculum, retraining faculty, and building new programs all take time and resources. So even if there's pressure to adapt, economically, it's not always realistic, which makes it hard to frame this as a clear moral obligation.
I think those constraints are real, but technological and social factors make this difficult to ignore. AI is actively changing how work is done, and that creates growing expectations that education stays relevant. Students expect to be prepared for a changing job market, so even if adapting is difficult, technological shifts and social expectations increase the pressure on universities to respond in some meaningful way.
So listening to both sides, is it possible that we're all making assumptions about how AI will actually impact the future? Could our own perspectives be shaping how we see this issue more than we realize?
I think that's fair. And even from this side, there could be some bias in assuming things won't change as much as we think. It's easy to assume things will continue as they always have, but that could lead to overlooking real shifts caused by AI. So while I still don't think there's a clear moral obligation, completely ignoring those changes could also be a form of bias, just in the opposite direction.
I think that applies to this side as well. There's a risk of overconfidence in assuming we fully understand how AI will impact jobs and industries. We may be overestimating how quickly or how broadly those changes will happen. So while I still think universities have a responsibility to respond, that response shouldn't be based on panic or certainty, but on careful, thoughtful adaptation. Otherwise, we risk making decisions based on assumptions that may not fully play out.
So if situations like Vendasta become more common, does that change the level of responsibility universities have? Because it seems like there's a real tension here. If universities adapt, they risk chasing uncertainty. But if they don't adapt, they risk failing to prepare their students. So the question becomes, who should carry that responsibility? The institutions or the individuals?